I suppose it is like that. After all, don't thieves hate other thieves as well? If that's the case, then it only makes sense that demons would hate other demons. Philomena Polino. Hello everyone! This is actually a response to a variety of issues. This is part of my reaction to the geopolitical situation in my homeland of the Philippines. What with a certain other country trying to muscle in on our sovereign territory in the West Philippine Sea. This is also associated with what I think of the issue regarding Shay Mitchell, a renowned Filipino-Canadian model and the voice actress for the anime character Alexandra Trece, when she openly denied her Filipino heritage. Another issue I seek to address with this video is a challenge regarding giving the Philippines our own version of Games Workshop's Chaos Gods. And of course, there's the fact that all of this is just essentially my disdain towards the recent declarations and celebrations of Philippine Independence Day. With so many issues plaguing our nation today, and with our national security severely jeopardized now, I can't help but not feel any excitement over our now alleged independence and can only despair of things to come. But enough about that. After all, I know what you've come for. You're here for the monsters, the terrible evil gods that the heroes of Hexed will be facing. I present to you now the gods of the void of Hexed, formerly Island Crusade. I decided to change the name of my own IP out of respect for Tuomas Prinian and Mike Francina, the creators of the Trench Crusade miniatures game, which inspired this particular work. After all, they deserve all the credit, popularity, and wealth for their own IP. I have my own ideas and concepts that might clash with theirs given enough time. Anyway, special shout out to Mr. Jonathan Green, a longtime supporter of this channel, and special thanks too to Miss Lorraine Garcia, who just very recently reviewed my introduction to Hexed, formerly known as Island Crusade. Alright, with all that out of the way, let's peer deep into the darkness so that we may be better able to see the enemies of mankind, the gods of the void. As mentioned beforehand in a previous video about Island Crusade, now renamed Hexed, 6 terrible beings were unleashed upon the world when a corrupt, perverted, and cruel religious leader in the Philippines committed a most terrible atrocity. Through the mass murder of many innocent children on June 6, 2006, forever remembered as the Devil's Hour, the evil pastor Marcelo Magno was able to bring forth terrible entities from another dimension into our own universe, which wreaked havoc throughout the world. It severely damaged most national infrastructures and outright destroyed some in a span of 3 days, known as the Endless Dark, a time when darkness and evil reigned over the earth for 72 hours. These eldritch horrors from beyond the boundaries of space-time are Vlur, the potentate of shadows, Hak, the chieftain of fire, Quish, the maiden of air, Zorl, the magus of water, Yug, the harlot of earth, and Spine, the blood empress. The remnants of the United Nations, also now known as the Intercontinental Union, have branded these beings as Void Gods, or EEEs, which stands for Eldritch Extra-Dimensional Entities. They are the ultimate threat to the world since the day they arrived, and have already laid waste to many countries all over the globe. A combined effort has been made to combat them, and while parts of the world are still safe or have begun to recover from the damage they've caused, they remain at large, biding their time in the Philippines. To properly combat the Void Gods, one must first understand their true nature. We shall start Hak, also known as the Chieftain of Fire, the Lord of the Flame, the Devourer of Souls, and the Obliterator of the Spirit. Hak is best known for his association with uncontrolled fire and anger. In the year 2010, he succeeded in reducing most of the cities, towns, and settlements of eastern China to ash and ruin. Taiwan and Singapore have managed to hold off his forces with the help of the various factions formed in the wake of the Endless Dark, such as the Continental Treaty of Asia and the large corporate conglomerate known as Chitin. However, this is mostly just a temporary measure. Even now, Hak's forces continue to wage war on Indonesia, Malaysia, and Papua New Guinea, and are now trying to make their way to Australia and New Zealand. He also has a small presence in South America, but the combined efforts of the nebulous group WASP, alleged terrorist organization BOA, the private military contractors of Steed, and what is rumored to be a small cult of another void god have prevented him from enacting his plan to set the entirety of the Amazon rainforest on fire. As mentioned, Hak is most often linked to fire or heat in general, as well as fury and rage, especially if the latter is uncontrolled or unprovoked. As such, he is often worshipped throughout the world by deranged arsonists and spree killers who are out for disproportionate revenge. Much like the other void gods, he does attract serial killers as well, although these are few and far between since the Chieftain of Fire usually prefers a much more direct and highly conspicuous approach both in battle and in acquiring additional recruits. That said, burning down key structures that are still occupied by people is one way to attract his attention. With more victims, the better. Hak's forces or cultists are often either utterly insane arsonists or deeply embittered and nihilistic men and women who just want to watch the world burn. They are often marked by the Lord of the Flame, bearing cruel burn scars somewhere or all over their body. It is also not surprising that their choice of weapons tend to be incendiary or explosive in nature, such as flamethrowers, white phosphorus grenades, or even just simple torches that can double as cudgels. The most devout and therefore most mentally unstable of Hak's warriors are cursed, although these people probably feel blessed by this, with the ability to undergo spontaneous combustion, their bodies simply exploding in a shower of destructive flames. This is a trait shared by his Hexed, who are almost always on fire. They are quite well known for their battle cry, "Kindling for the Fire God," which is usually followed by "Ash for the Ashen Throne." The demonic manifestations of Hak are often on fire, or at least associated with fire, such as the tiny but highly destructive inferno flies, the massive and durable flame brutes, and the brutal and titanic demolishers. In battle, approaching these flaming horrors is very difficult save for the most well-protected of soldiers, and even then, their destructive abilities are the stuff of legend. His Hexed are also constantly burning and are difficult to approach, let alone combat, thanks to the extreme heat that often emanates from them. That said, a key weakness that was discovered about them is that their flames burn out in the presence of victims or devotees, so avoiding their attacks is often a preferred strategy rather than simply resisting the heat and flames up front, not to mention the fact that Hak's fire and flames are also vulnerable to the normal ways you would put out a fire, such as using water or dirt. Contrary to what most people believe, despite being more upfront than the other void gods, Hak is also quite the deceiver. often using his flames and their aroma to hypnotize victims. He is also known to visit victims of his flames in their dreams to convince them to fight for him, using their own anger, loss, and despair against them. Most often, he enjoys exaggerating the slights caused by others and inciting them into committing acts of violence for him that often involve arson or explosives. Then we have Quish, referred to as the Maiden of Air, the Lady of Lightning, the Woman in the Wind, the Hollow One, the Golden Princess, and the Platinum Baroness. Quish is most related to the element of air, the weather, and pompous emotions such as vanity, self-righteousness, greed, narcissism, and disdain and or contempt for the less fortunate. She is most active in Europe, Russia, the South American elite, and, most disturbingly, Australia, and is believed to actually be helping in repelling Hak from the two latter areas. She tends to be quite picky when choosing a misleader for her followers, and often attracts the rich and famous to join her in an effort to get even more worshippers. Indeed, unlike the other void gods, she prefers to corrupt the powerful but innocent with thoughts of arrogance and selfishness. Quish's favored form of sacrifice is death from falling from high places, and her cults often build great towers for exactly that purpose. Those who earn her favor are often granted the power of flight, while letting those who displease her in one form or another simply fall to their deaths. Quish makes herself known to the weather, as she has control over both wind and lightning. In fact, one way she is able to hypnotize or indoctrinate victims is by whispering to them through the wind and deceiving them with delusions of grandeur. Her worshippers and cultists tend to be celebrities of all stripes, from TV show personalities, star athletes, popular politicians, and social media influencers. The last tends to take up the vast bulk of her forces. Many of her cultists are also often secretly serial killers, whose primary method of killing involved pushing or throwing their victims from great heights, often making the latter's deaths appear as accidents. In the war proper, she gives her followers the power to control the wind and call down lightning upon their foes. However, while her powers tend to be awe-inspiring and her highest-ranking cultists tend to be breathtakingly beautiful, they are all too often poor combatants, and when finally caught, resort to things like guilt-tripping, blackmail, and social manipulation to escape justice. Quish's supernatural servants often take the form of gigantic living statues composed of gold and ivory that share a resemblance with the false gods and idols mentioned in the Bible and other Abrahamic texts, and also have the multi-armed appearances of some Hindu deities. Some of her spiritual servants include the shackle serpents, which are living golden chains adorned with lethal spikes and deadly hooks; gold birds, which are constructs of ivory and gold that look like mechanical birds, and whose songs are known to cause pain and madness; and the manipulators, which look like giant, six-armed women made of gold and ivory that can shoot lightning from their hands, eyes, and mouths, but are hollow and easily destroyed. Quish also commands great sky cities, which are city-like superstructures that float high above in the sky, but are not exactly intended for human habitation, even though they seem quite beautiful when seen from afar, since they often easily fall apart. These sky cities often contain her hollowed-out Hexed, who are granted the power to fly, but are vulnerable to most anti-aircraft weapons. However, just about all the mechanical constructs of Quish are hollow and empty, and while they are all quick and usually hard to hit, a single well-placed and well-timed attack can often destroy them or at least incapacitate them. Quish often uses her appearance to deceive and manipulate human victims into worshipping and serving her, usually claiming to be an angel or a goddess. As stated by former cultists who have been deprogrammed, her promises are hollow and self-serving, and she is every bit as perverse and corrupt as the other void gods. Her beauty and voice might easily fool the unwary, but by listening to her claims, comparing them to her intent and actions, and thinking critically, one can deduct her true identity and motives. She openly dislikes people who are not conventionally attractive and refuses to accept them as cultists or even just sacrifices, which leads to her being the ultimate enemy of her sister, Yug. Another void god would be Zorl, also named the Magus of Water, the ruler of the depths, the Deep Lord, the Sultan of Storms, and the Wizard of Floods. He embodies the mysterious and fickle waters of the earth, as well as man's selfishness, solipsism, lack of conviction, and apathy. Zorl currently besieges South Asia, Western China, and most of Africa by pummeling them with salted rainstorms and brine deluges, submerging their cities and towns, and drowning their people by the thousands. The efforts of the International Anti-Terrorist Organization, Goshawk, and the Continental Treaty of Africa have managed to mitigate the damage caused by Zorl's forces, but only just. Due to Zorl's ability to appear anywhere where there is a body of salt water that is either not treated or ritually cleansed, has made it difficult to locate other places he and his cult may actually be operating in. As you can probably guess by now, Zorl's abilities have a lot to do with salt water, apathy, and selfishness in general, most especially gluttony. Zorl's cultists are numerous as they are stealthy and deceptive, easily able to infiltrate societies with barely a hint of their malevolent presence. They often work to get in on the plans of said societies, or do the planning themselves, only to sabotage it viciously when least expected, causing irreparable damage and countless deaths. Most of his followers tend to be misunderstood geniuses or experts whose opinions are often overlooked, preying on their vulnerability and gullibility in order to enact his plans. What most of his pawns aren't aware of is that they often work against one another just as they are working together, as Zorl prefers multiple plans that all too often conflict with one another so long as they ultimately achieve his goals. Zorl's preferred form of sacrifice is that of death by drowning, and most of his adherents live on or near the coast of various cities for exactly that purpose. Zorl's Hexed often appear like horribly mutated people, with the most common mutation being tentacles and eyes and mouths found in the most unlikely of places on or in their bodies. They are often silent and stealthy, often blending in with their dreary environments. Zorl's psychic manifestations include the lamprey-like but amphibious soul suckers, the psychic tentacle blobs that are the enslavers, and the huge and horrid violators. The minions of Zorl can be extremely deadly, but almost all of them have a weakness to fresh water, which either lulls them to immobility or outright burns and kills them. Zorl has followers all over the world thanks to the fact that he is associated with the oceans and seas of the earth, although he has trouble moving further inland, as freshwater rivers and lakes actively harm him and his forces. This is why he often uses his unholy sorcery to create storms that are saturated with bitter and salty pollutants so that he may be able to further intrude into the territories of his enemies. Luckily though, while also another void god, Yug, the mother of monsters, often comes into conflict with him and works to sabotage his plans to spread his influence further inland. Of course, there is now Yug, also known as the Harlot of the Earth, the Dowager of Filth, the Empress of Ugliness, the Mother of Monsters, the Plague Wretch, the moss hag, the cave witch, the diseased harridan, and herald of decay. She is most associated with the element of earth, underground places, disease, decay, fungi, as well as sorrow, self-pity, malice, bitterness, envy, everything disgusting, and the will to share one's pain and misery with others who are more fortunate. Yug is most dominant in Europe and North America, where she spreads her disease, the green mold, like the bubonic plague, creating even more hexed, willing to serve her will, as well as enthralling more hapless bystanders to serve as her cultists. Luckily, she faces a lot of opposition as nearly all the remaining forces of mankind fight the many diseases she has created, as well as her countless servants and demonic minions. Yug's cultists often operate either in elaborate underground bases or are hidden within dilapidated structures. Their weapons are either biological weapons or common items like makeshift clubs made of sticks with embedded nails that can further spread her green mold. Various vehicles and buildings used by her cultists are usually rusted, broken down, and are on the verge of falling apart but are somehow still kept together by her vile magic. Indeed, many of the poor souls that serve her are held together and kept alive by her disgusting fungi, even though they are already being reduced to sludge by their sicknesses. Yug can boast of having the most numerous followers, as those contaminated with the green mold can be found all over the world. While not incurable, it is a debilitating condition that, if not remedied quickly, can result in one becoming hexed, or worse, becoming one of her innumerable monstrous servitors. Some of Yug's psychic manifestations include the tiny and nearly gaseous sporelings, the hairy and disgusting spore flies, their offspring the decay maggots, the lumbering flesh brutes, and the truly nauseating and disturbing defilers. That said, Yug's forces may be many, but can be easily defeated by a determined and courageous foe. Even Yug's green mold can be cured with well-cooked meals or even just well-placed table salt. Yug's forces may seem countless and overwhelming, but they fall easily to enemies willing to exploit her servants' many glaring weaknesses, such as their slowness, their vulnerability to fire, sunlight, and explosions, as well as the fact that her many plagues and afflictions can be fought off by simple prevention or even just folk cures. Yug also faces hostilities from the other void gods who are mutually inimical to her, with Huck's flames being a danger to her flammable fungi, Quish outright detesting her and what she represents, and Zorl actively working against her. Her only real ally among them is Vlur, who she more or less tolerates and who tolerates her in return, most likely out of necessity. The fifth void god is Vlur, sometimes called the potentate of shadows, the king of the dead, prince of delusion, pontiff of the deceased, the shogun of anguish, the jarl of emptiness, and the pharaoh of oblivion. He is most associated with fear, panic, obsession, loss, and preoccupation with the past and the long dead, as well as darkness, the night, corpses, and shadows. Vlur is the only void god that has forces located throughout the world and actively engages all those who would resist the void and the hex simultaneously. Vlur's forces are the hardest to fight because they are prepared for almost everything, with his cultists often being veterans of one war or another or survivors of terrible disasters who cannot, for the life of them, put behind their horrific experiences. The cultists of Vlur often use any weapon they can at their disposal, as the potentate of shadows finds little time or value in actually changing them. His hexed are also annoyingly difficult to detect, save for their eyes, which usually go blank, become completely black, or become empty yawning voids where their eyes should be. Both the cultists and Hexed of Vlur often gather in dark places or during the dead of night in sparsely populated areas. The psychic manifestations of Vlur are often just monsters made of shadow, but are actually quite deadly if one doesn't know how to fight them effectively. Darklings are his most basic servants, appearing similar to the shadows of human beings, and often pretending to be such when made to infiltrate a populated area. Shades, which are often mistaken for the ghosts of the dead, are beings that drive victims into depression, insanity, and self-destruction. Gloom vampires are the thin and long-limbed horrors with abysses for eyes that serve as his hunting dogs of sorts, which drain the vitality of their prey through their gaze alone. Finally, Vlur's strongest psychic manifestation is the Despot, a giant made seemingly out of total darkness that saps all their nearby enemies of their will to live. That said, Vlur's obvious weakness is bright light from any source, and it is also said that acceptance of given facts is known to weaken his hold over a person. While Vlur may be the most dominant of the Void Gods and is their leader of sorts, his vulnerability to light, including sunlight, is greatly inimical to him and his forces. Of course, some of them can still operate during daytime or in the presence of light, but often do so at a very reduced rate. Vlur is also literally harmed by the truth, with people who might be indoctrinated by him managing to break free of his control simply by accepting difficult facts. Last of the Void Gods is Spine, who is, thankfully, dead. Simply referred to as the Blood Empress, she is thought to be the bride of Vlur himself. Luckily for humanity, she was severely weakened upon her arrival to Earth due to a botched sacrifice, and then slain by a small group of angry Filipinos before she could do any significant damage to humankind. Her death also seemed to greatly reduce Blur's power and prevent all the other Void Gods from reaching their full strength. It is believed by many, in fact, that her premature death is what caused the endless dark to last only 3 days instead of an indefinite amount of time.